The telephone. Every school teaches that its inventor was Alexander Graham Bell. But according to historical records, between 1850s and 1860s, an Italian inventor by the name of Antonio Meucci had built experimental voice communication devices. He reportedly used them to communicate with his ill wife from another room in their house. He even called this invention the teletrafono. But Antonio had a problem. He was dirt poor. Instead of filing a full patent, he filed a cheaper temporary notice in 1871 called a patent caveat, which basically was saying, "I'm working on this invention and may patent it later." But Antonio couldn't always renew the caveat fee, and he allegedly lost some of his models and papers after sending them to a laboratory connected to Western Union, the giant communications company of the era with employees that Bell had great relationships with. Then Bell comes along a few years later to file the telephone patent. In 2002, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution recognizing Meucci's contributions to the invention of the telephone. Evidence suggests Meucci had functioning concepts before Bell patented his device. Historians generally agree that Meucci developed early voice transmission technology way before Bell, but it was Bell who produced the first fully patented and commercially successful telephone system. The light bulb. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. That goes to Humphrey Davy. In the early 1800s, Davy created one of the first electric lights using wires, a battery, and glowing carbon. This became known as the arc lamp. And while this invention was extremely bright, unstable, impractical for homes, and burned out quickly, Davy was still the one who discovered that electricity could produce artificial light. That was the real breakthrough. After Davy, many inventors kept improving electric lighting over decades. Some key names include Warren de la Rue, who used platinum filaments in vacuum tubes. It worked well but was too expensive. Frederick de Moulins, who actually received one of the earliest light bulb patents. Joseph Swan, a British inventor who created a working incandescent bulb before Edison's famous version. Swan's bulbs were already even being demonstrated publicly in Britain in the 1870s. And more. Then Edison came along and massively improved the design, created longer-lasting filaments, improved the vacuum system, and most importantly created an entire commercial electrical lighting system. Edison was more of a smart businessman, not necessarily an inventor. Tesla should know. Radio. Speaking of Tesla, the radio was one of his many inventions that was patented by another inventor. First, the discovery of radio depended on earlier discoveries by scientists like James Clerk Maxwell and Heinrich Hertz. Maxwell mathematically predicted electromagnetic waves while Hertz later proved they existed experimentally. These efforts laid the groundwork for wireless communication. Then came Nikola. By the 1890s, Tesla was deeply involved in wireless transmission research. He demonstrated wireless signal transmission, tuned circuits, resonant transformers, and radio frequency systems. Many technologies central to radio later appeared in his patents. In 1893, before Marconi's famous successes, Tesla publicly demonstrated principles of wireless communication. Then later, a younger, entrepreneurial Marconi came along, and in 1901, Marconi famously transmitted a signal across the Atlantic Ocean, which made global headlines. Some historians argue that Tesla had already described the essential architecture of radio systems before Marconi became famous. Marconi succeeded in transmitting wireless telegraph signals over long distances, attracting investors and building companies which enabled him to commercialize the technology. Critics pointed out that Marconi's systems relied on concepts already patented by Tesla. In fact, at one point, the U.S. Patent Office actually rejected some of Marconi's claims partly because of Tesla's earlier patents. Marconi's company gained enormous influence later on, and Marconi secured major patent victories, causing some to say money and political influence beat originality. But in 1943, months after Tesla died, the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated key Marconi radio patents. This became the origin of Tesla actually invented radio. Electric vehicles. I hope you don't think it's Musk, or even Tesla Incorporated, because it's not. In fact, here's a fact you may find hard to believe. Electric cars existed as far back as the 1800s. In the early to mid-1800s, inventors in Europe and America were already experimenting with electrically powered vehicles. Some important pioneers include Robert Anderson, Thomas Davenport, and Eneos Jedlik. These early machines were primitive, slow, heavy, battery-limited, and often were used more like carriages than modern cars. But the idea of a vehicle powered by electricity already existed. By the late 1800s, three major car technologies were competing: steam cars, gasoline cars, and electric cars were actually considered better. They were quieter, smoother, cleaner, easier to start, and less terrifying, while gasoline cars were loud, unreliable, smoky, and sometimes dangerous to crank start. There were even electric taxis in New York in the 1890s. But then oil became abundant, making it cheap and a better option to early car batteries which took forever to charge. Gasoline cars also could travel for longer ranges and could be pumped quickly. To then finish it off, Henry Ford came along, and his Ford Model T basically crushed the electric car economy. Then fast forward to the 2000s, Tesla Inc. has revamped the electric car, making it fast, luxurious, long-range, desirable, and technologically advanced. Before Tesla, EVs were seen as weak eco-cars, but now, they are high-performance status machines. That is what Tesla Inc. essentially did. They reinvented the public's perception on electric vehicles. They didn't invent EVs themselves. The airplane. Now this story is kind of dependent on the country you find yourself in. In most of the world, especially the US, the invention of the airplane is credited to the Wright brothers. But in Brazil, Alberto Santos-Dumont takes the credit. Here's why. In December 1903, the Wright brothers flew the Wright Flyer, an aircraft that was powered, heavier than air, controlled and piloted. While most historians credit this as the first successful airplane flight, the early Wright aircraft needed launch rails, strong winds, and even catapult-assisted systems later on. This was where the controversy was, and still is. Critics argue that since it could not take off fully under its own power from flat ground, it isn't a true airplane. The Wright brothers were also notoriously secretive as the flight was conducted privately. They avoided public demonstrations and focused aggressively on patents, causing many aviators at the time to believe that they just wanted to monopolize the aviation industry. Meanwhile, in Europe, Alberto Santos-Dumont became a huge celebrity inventor. He was already famous for airships and aviation experiments in Paris. Then in 1906, he flew the 14 bis, an aircraft that took off under its own power, from level ground and without catapults or launch systems. Because of this, supporters say that Santos-Dumont achieved the first true airplane flight. His demonstration also was publicly and officially observed before large crowds and aviation officials in France. Santos-Dumont also openly shared ideas, became beloved in France and Brazil, and was viewed as more idealistic. In Brazil, schools often teach that Santos-Dumont invented the airplane, not the Wright brothers. The idea of the airplane, however, was developed by several people other than Alberto or the Wright brothers. One such person is Samuel Langley, an elite scientist backed by government funding. He almost beat the Wright brothers to the first airplane demonstration, but after disastrous flight demonstrations that crashed into water, history shifted to the bicycle mechanics just days later. The printing press. Before Gutenberg revolutionized printing and the information industry, China already was producing books centuries before he was even born. China already had paper, ink, woodblock printing, and mass-produced books. By the reign of the Tang dynasty between the 7th to 10th century, entire pages were carved into wooden blocks, inked and pressed onto paper. Then a Chinese engineer in the name of Sheng came along and did something revolutionary. Instead of carving entire pages into one woodblock, he created movable type. That means individual characters could be rearranged and reused. Sheng made individual characters from baked clay, that is ceramic type, arranged them on an iron plate, inked them, and printed pages. After printing, the characters could be reused for other texts. This is basically the core concept that is associated with Gutenberg. So why didn't Sheng get the credit? Because Chinese writing uses thousands of characters, so movable type in China was far more complex, harder to organize, and less efficient. This was quite impractical to use for the Western world. Then Gutenberg came along and combined several technologies into an extremely efficient system of metal movable type, oil-based inks, durable molds, and screw press mechanics. It worked incredibly well with alphabetic European languages, causing Gutenberg's printed press to explode economically. His printing revolution became tied to European expansion, science, capitalism, and modern institutions. This is why Gutenberg is credited as the inventor. He made the most efficient and practical printing press, but it's not that he invented it out of nothing. Even Korea developed the metal movable type way before Gutenberg as well. One famous surviving example is the Jikji, which was printed in 1377, decades before Gutenberg's famous Bible. So is the Gutenberg story fake then? No. But the simplified Gutenberg invented printing story is historically wrong. A more accurate version is printing and movable type already existed in Asia centuries earlier, but Gutenberg created the system that transformed Europe and reshaped world history. Sheng isn't spoken about because much of what we know about him comes from written records rather than surviving machines. Western education traditionally centered around European breakthroughs, even though the technology often credited with creating the modern Western world actually had key conceptual roots in East Asia centuries earlier. Ironic.